Go about this. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see everybody. As you probably know, this is an event that takes place annually. It has for 4 years now, and it's a collaboration between the Instituto Cervantes and the Centre for Catalan Studies at Queen Mary, University of London, with the grateful support of the Instituto Ramon Llull as well as the Instituto Cervantes. The whole point of this lecture is to focus on Catalan literature, but spread that focus beyond simply Catalonia and talk about it in a way that becomes accessible and has been for the last 3 years at least in English. So Victor, the director of the Instituto Cervantes, is going to say a few words, and then I'll say a few words to introduce our speaker, Josep-Anton Fernàndez. But first, Victor, thank you again for the collaboration, and you've come direct on the district line from the Instituto Cervantes.
No, I didn't leave the bicycle.
Oh, right. Right. Okay, great. That deserves a
That's why I'm late, so I'm sorry because the GPS was crazy. So, Josep-Anton, benvingut, moltes gràcies, Joan, moltes gràcies a tothom, i Marc també del Ramon Llull. Thank you very much, everybody. Just say hello because I'm late, so I don't want to spend, I just want to go through this presentation. Just let you know that the Instituto Cervantes is not just promoting the Spanish language, but also Catalan, Basque, and Galician language. In fact, we have Catalan classes currently going on. So we are going to have a course on history of the language and culture from Catalonia near soon. So I invite you to come to our library to join our activities related to Catalonia, which are some of them. I brought some leaflets, so I will let you know later. So that's all. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the speech. Thank you very much.
If you happen to be near Queen Mary Mile End, you can also come to the classes at Queen Mary for Catalan language, because now they are open to everybody. We're catering for different audiences here, for different potential public. Anyway, to introduce Josep-Anton, who many of you know already, he has just become again part of the Instituto Ramon Llull. That's why you see the parenthetical comment, but until a few months ago he was at the UOC, the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, the Catalan Open University, and before that he was in the Ramon Llull as well, working in a similar position, and before that he was at Queen Mary. Before that you were at the UOC again, and then you were at Queen Mary before that as well. So he in fact founded the Centre for Catalan Studies in 2005-2006, so we're grateful to him for this existence, and was for a long time, from the 1990s in fact, the principal lecturer in Catalan studies at Queen Mary. Did a lot to consolidate Catalan studies at Queen Mary, which existed before, but really were consolidated by Josep-Anton. And some of you must know his publications, but let me signal again a few of them so you can look them up or remember them. Another Country, the year 2000, which is a revised version of his doctoral thesis on gay literature in Catalan. And this very polemical book he published in 2008, El malestar en la cultura catalana, which really made us reassess the relationship along the lines of cultural history between Catalan culture, modernity, between Catalan modernity and post-modernity, and had a quite polemical, controversial interpretation of those phenomena that in fact still goes on, and people think they've still got to refer to the book to agree with it or contradict it. And Gay Saber, you were editor of that book on gay lesbian studies as well. In addition to which, it's difficult to mention even a selection of your articles, but you pick an author from the 20th century especially, and Josep-Anton has written about them usually. One of my favourites that I'm rereading is on La Plaza del Diamant, Rodorrega's famous novel. He does have something new to say about it, so if you haven't read that article, I'd I'd recommend it. But today you're going to speak about a series of different authors, and we've seen the summary, so we're looking forward to this. An empty origin, migration, mourning in the Catalan literature of the Argentine diaspora. So we're taking what I mentioned before, that view that goes outside Catalonia to look back at Catalonia and Catalan literature. Welcome, and I hope you feel more or less at home, at least for the next 2 hours.
Thank you so much, John, for that really exaggerated introduction, which I'm really thankful for. And indeed, I have this feeling of coming back home. Every time I come to London, I have that feeling, but especially coming to this building. Things have changed, but there is a certain air that remains. And also...
They didn't clean your room, that's all.
Well... You should have seen what my room was like when I left. It's also great to see old friends and partners in crime. And I hope we have a chance to catch up later. What I'm presenting today is, in fact, is the confluence of two interests of mine. One is the representations of immigration, and the other is psychoanalysis. I'll be talking specifically about mourning. I hope I will manage. Unfortunately, my mother died on Boxing Day. That's the reason why the previous date for this lecture was cancelled. The month of December was very complicated for family reasons. So I hope I won't get too emotional at some point. So, an empty origin, migration and mourning in the Catalan literature of the Argentine diaspora. Compared to other experiences of migration to Catalonia, the Argentine case is singular because, generally speaking, it has been caused not by a desire to seek opportunities in a new land, but by deeply traumatic events, be it a military dictatorship or a devastating financial crisis. These migrations were built on a long-standing history of transatlantic exchanges, whereby thousands of people from the Catalan-speaking territories settled in Argentina in the 19th and early 20th centuries, later followed by the Republican exile of 1939. In the mid-1970s, a population flow began in the opposite direction, when large numbers of Argentine political exiles sought refuge in Catalonia, escaping from the military dictatorship. A large Argentine community settled in cities like Barcelona, giving rise to important cultural, economic, and intellectual exchanges. 2 decades later, following the financial crisis of 2001, which we call the Corralito, because the government confiscated all bank accounts, people had no money, so people were corralled in a way. So that financial crisis led to the collapse of the country's economy, and then another important wave of migration from Argentina to Catalonia occurred, now motivated by economic reasons. Argentine migration and its literary representation needs to be placed in the broader context of immigration in Catalan culture, which is a paradoxical phenomenon in that a rich and complex historical experience contrasts with a surprising poverty of representations. And this is really striking. Until relatively recently, there are very few representations of immigration in literary terms. Catalonia has been a net population importer for centuries. Demographers Ana Cabré and Andreu Domingo have claimed that immigration is in fact an integral part of Catalonia's system of social reproduction. Immigration in Catalonia, says Cabré, is a process that begins in the wake of industrialization, compensating for a very early reduction in the birth rate. In fact, in the 19th century, 3 countries, France, Hungary, and Catalonia, have a very low birth rate. So, in the case of Catalonia, this produces the phenomenon of immigration. Starting with internal migrations from rural districts to industrial areas, the attraction of a rapidly developing Catalonia extended beyond its own borders. Catalonia in the 20th century experienced an enormous demographic transformation, to the point that in the year 2000, 75% of Catalans had a migrant background. At the start of the 21st century, a wave of international immigration brought 1 million people to Catalonia. The proportions of this last wave were also massive. The percentage of registered foreigners went from 4% of the population to 16% in 10 years. However, until the end of the 20th century, the migratory processes originating in Spain remained largely unrepresented in Catalan literature. Sociologist Salvador Cardús argues that until recently, immigration was associated in cultural discourses, but not in social experience, with a threatening foreignness. Furthermore, the subordination of Catalan culture led to emphasizing the trope of cultural roots as a defensive reaction to political weakness. So immigration became un cos estrany, says Cardús, a foreign body that couldn't be metabolized into cultural discourse and thus remained an unsymbolized trauma. The massive influx of population from Africa, the Maghreb, Latin America, and Asia to Catalonia after 2000 helped reactivate the social mechanisms of oblivion and memory required for the literary representation of both the memory of Spanish immigration and the latest migratory wave. Texts such as Maria Barbal's Carrer Bolívia or Jordi Puntís Els Castellans revisit the relationship with the Spanish other, while works by Najat El-Hashmi, Said El-Karawi, Pius Alibek, or Agnès Arborton depict more recent migrations, particularly from Northern Africa, from the Middle East, or Sub-Saharan Africa. And yet, the Argentine case is unique. Despite the importance of the Argentinian presence in Catalonia, Catalan literature has been slow to incorporate the experience of this community. However, a small but significant contingent of Argentine authors, who happen to be women, have chosen Catalan as their language of literary expression. They will be the focus of my talk. Novelist Silvana Bot studied philosophy in Buenos Aires, where she worked as a radio journalist. In 2002, after the economic and social crisis of the Corralito, she emigrated to Barcelona, where she has worked as a journalist, teacher, and bookseller. In 2016, she published her first novel, La mecánica del agua, The Mechanics of Water, the main text I will discuss today. The second author is playwright Victoria Spunberg, born in Buenos Aires in 1973, and whose father, poet Alberto Spunberg, went into exile in Catalonia with his family in 1976. Spunberg is the author of an extensive theatrical oeuvre. Today I will examine the trilogy La fragilidad de la memoria, cómo narrar un hecho abismal, el del exilio y la última dictadura argentina, The Fragility of Memory, how to narrate an abyssal experience, exile, and the latest Argentinian dictatorship. And finally, Patricia Gavancho, who was born in 1952 and died sadly in 2017, was a journalist, essayist, and novelist born in Buenos Aires and who lived in Barcelona since 1974. She left an extensive body of essays and the novel La neta d'Adam, published in 2012, which I will briefly discuss. These texts articulate the affective dimension of migration within the frame of the work of Mourning. Immigration is a traumatic experience of loss, the loss of a familiar landscape, relationships, cultural references, language, and so on. Scholars have approached this experience in a variety of ways. Object relations psychoanalysis, for example, focuses on aspects such as immigrant nostalgia, or the psychic dislocation and fragmentation of one's sense of community that immigration entails. However, the texts I will examine today resist this approach because the protagonists neither suffer from nostalgia for a country that they sometimes reject, nor seek a sense of community with fellow countryfolk. Thus, I propose to return to Freud's idea on mourning, and then revise two recent theoretical elaborations of the issue in order to consider the social dimension of mourning and how it articulates with immigration. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud defines mourning as the reaction to the loss of a beloved person or an abstraction taking the place of the person, such as fatherland, freedom, an ideal, and so on. By contrast, melancholia, or pathological mourning, features in addition a reduction in the sense of self, expressed in self-recrimination. In the work of Mourning, Freud says, reality testing has revealed that the beloved object no longer exists and demands that the libido as a whole sever its bonds with the object. But this is opposed to a contrary tendency, as people are reluctant to abandon a libido position. So when we lost somebody, we keep thinking about that person, the representation we have in our mind, and this little by little removes the attachment to that person, but at the same time we don't want to lose that attachment. So it's the sort of a conflict. Thus, in this process, the ego will confront the representations of the lost object. He says, each individual memory and expectation in which the libido was connected to the object is adjusted and hyper-invested, leading to a detachment from the libido. Now, in melancholia, pathological mourning, says Freud, this process cannot be completed because the subject identifies with a lost object tainted by the ambivalence of relationships. And so the recriminations against the lost object are mercilessly directed against the ego. However, ambivalence is present in every affective relationship. In fact, Freud later developed his concept of the ego on the basis of the identification mechanisms he described in Melancholia. Thus, we identify with the objects we love and lose. And as Diana first points out, and this is the quotation I showed you too early, the subject in mourning simply converts the lost love object into an identification, in effect becoming the object that it can no longer have. So in a way, when we lose somebody, we incorporate that other person or object as an identification. We work through the loss of a loved object, but we also mourn the part of ourselves that we lost in that object. Freud's statement that the mourner knows who it is, but not what it is about that person that he has lost, doesn't just apply to the melancholic, but to everybody who is in mourning. Whereas Freud presents mourning as an individual task, recent psychoanalytic approaches emphasize its social dimension. Darien Leader stresses the subjective need for representation in order to undergo bereavement. The ego, he says, is built not simply through our experience of loss, but through the registration of loss. A separation only becomes a loss when it is registered, when it is certified, as it were. This act of registration, essential to symbolize loss, requires the participation of the other, of a third party that authenticates the experience of loss. Thus, mourning has a crucial social dimension that, according to Leader, is manifested in... Again, too early. Mourning has a crucial social dimension that, according to Leader, is manifested in a dialogue of mournings. For her part, this other author, Laurie Lefer, presents mourning as une énigme de l'inconscient that questions the subject's desire, its temporality and its relation to the lost object. The mourner hasn't simply lost the object, she has lost l'histoire et le temps de l'objet, c'est-à-dire un temps et une histoire l'identifiant. Thus, what can be traced in mourning is la position de désir du survivant pour le mort. Mourning entails confronting the enigma of the desire of the other by means of the reconstruction of the image of the lost object through its inscription into what Lofer terms un lieu psychique de sépulture. Lofer emphasizes the social dimension of mourning as it situates mourning within a symbolic exchange. This is pretty theoretical and abstract, but it will become very concrete. In La Mecánica del Agua, The Mechanics of Water, Silvana Bott offers a moving account of the Corralito migration that features the psychic phenomena I just described. The novel presents the story of Beda, a journalist from Buenos Aires, who leaves a country she despises in order to start a new life in Barcelona. The plot starts just before Argentina defaults on its national debt and collapses into an economic and political crisis. Trapped in a toxic relationship and fed up with a corrupt local councillor that sponsors the community radio where she works, she is devastated by the death of her friend Fierita, one of the volunteers at the station. This loss prompts Vera to demand more funding from the politician, who gives her $5,000 in cash in exchange for not revealing his corrupt dealings. Soon after, however, the country defaults and the government confiscates all bank accounts. She hasn't put the money in the bank. She keeps it at home. In the face of social chaos, Vera decides to use the cash to migrate to Barcelona with her dog Cantiano. In Barcelona, she will meet Nil, an aspiring novelist fascinated by Julio Cortázar, and Elisa Musol, a publisher whose life has been marked by losses he struggles to mourn. Beda builds a new life in Catalonia. After taking some precarious jobs, she works as an archivist for an Liceu and legalizes her status as a migrant. Beda and the Liceu develop a friendship that will help both of them come to terms with their losses, only to meet a tragic ending. Vought's novel features some elements that are relevant for an analysis of mourning. A traumatic scene that causes the loss of the protagonist's country, a transgression that leads to deep ambivalence with regards to the lost country, and the key role of repetition. However, what is it exactly that the protagonist loses? It might be difficult to characterize the psychic process in this text as migratory mourning because of the disdain Vera feels for Argentina. She really hates her country. Furthermore, the narrator makes no reference to the family Vera has left behind, or to the history of Argentina. It is as though the past, both personal and collective, had been deleted to create a blank slate, contrasting with the effects of transgressive acts and the attachment to identities, which are presented as indelible marks. As I will argue, ambivalence in this novel pivots on the tension between the blank slate and these indelible marks. According to Laurie Lofer, the trauma of loss upsets the subject's temporality, which becomes a frozen, fixed time, which he says, un pur instant qui excède le temps, un toujours présent that keeps the psychic hemorrhage open. Immersed in this abysmal present, the mourner must revive her fossilized memory and make her desire flow once again. It is therefore highly relevant that Vought's novel is narrated in the present tense and inscribes the scene of writing into the text. The narrative voice keeps repeating the words la veig, puc veure-la. And four of the novel's 10 chapters start with these words. The scene of writing is superimposed on the events of the past, as though time had stopped in an eternal present. In the first chapter, we witness the two traumatic events that motivate Vera's migration: the death of her friend Fierita and the Corralito. The former is particularly painful. Fierita is a drug addict who volunteers at the community radio station that Vera runs. His gruesome death, he injects some of the glue that he used to inhale, leaves Vera with a buit a la cintura, roaming Buenos Aires absent and numb, sense mirar ningú, sense esperar res de ningú, sense sentir res per ningú. However, the latter event, the Corralito, upsets the life of the entire society. It is described as an event with a life of its own, acting out of its own will. And the narrator says, la seva astúcia, the craftiness of the Corralito, és directament proporcional al caos que provoca, al naufragi que origina, com si fos un bloc de gel surant al bell mig de l'oceà, calculant en quin lloc del vaixell ha d'impactar per trencar la línia de flotació. The Corralito disrupts social life because it brings the circuit of economic exchange to a complete halt, destroying the possibility of making plans for the future. Thus, social time is out of joint, but so is psychic temporality. Vera's mourning is marked by two distinct elements. Firstly, a failed attempt to symbolize her loss, which becomes instead a bodily inscription of pain that literalizes the paralysis of time. After Fierita's death, she decides to get a tattoo of the figure 365, which is the number of pages of her favorite book, but obviously also the number of days in the year. As the tattoo artist repeatedly pierces her skin, Vera is sorda, indiferent a les paraules de l'altre, and es concentra en el dolor, amb cada fiblada un record, amb cada laceració un oblit. Vera's tattoo signifies une suspension du temps psychique, une saturation du temps dans le corps pulsionnel. This suspension of time is also suggested by the compass Fierita had given Vera as a present, which she treasures as a fetish and whose needle is fixed on the south. The second element in Vera's mourning is an act of transgression, the theft of $5,000. When the government decrees the confiscation of all bank accounts, Vera hides the money, but when she finds out that the radio station is closing down, she makes una decisión. She takes the money and leaves for Barcelona. Thanks to this decision, Vera resuscitates, but the very act that allows her to survive fills her with guilt and with a sense of debt. Let's now move on to Victoria Spoonberg's trilogy, La fragilidad de la memoria, The Fragility of Memory, a work on the inherited trauma of the last Argentinian dictatorship. The metatheatrical component of this place calls into question the possibility of symbolizing and understanding these traumatic experiences, as the subtitle Cómo narrar un hecho abismal, How to narrate an abyssal experience, suggests. In the first piece, El meu avi no va anar a Cuba, My Grandfather Didn't Go to Cuba, which is a reference to a popular song, referring to the Cuban War of 1898. In this piece, a Catalan actress of Andalusian origin lands a role in a film, playing Ana, an Argentine political activist who, after the coup d'etat in 1976, avoids being captured by the military. The second piece, La marca preferida de las hermanas Klausman, the favorite brand of the Klausman sisters, features two teenage sisters living in a coastal town near Barcelona in the early 1990s. Sara and Valentina, who have grown up in a context of rampant consumerism, are obsessed with fashion labels they cannot afford. Their mother, an exile from Argentina, is unable to leave her room and never appears on stage. The sisters cannot make sense of their mother's depression. They repeatedly act out the scene in which the mother avoided being captured by the military. Finally, La Memoria de una Ludicia, The Memory of a Ludicia, which I understand is a kind of plant, is a short piece for radio in which we hear three voices. La Mujer, the woman, an Argentinian who explains her daily life and recalls the dictatorship. La Periodista Realizadora, the journalist, who interviews La Mujer, the woman, and insistently asks her whether she considers herself a victim. And finally, La Jove, the young woman, who confesses her inability to understand the pain of her mother. As in Vogt's novel, here we find three relevant elements that structure the action. Firstly, a traumatic scene. The woman receives a coded call warning her that a fellow activist has been arrested, so the appointment between the woman, her partner, and another militant has been cancelled. The woman telephones various people to warn them of the impending danger and plans her escape. But meanwhile, a group of armed men arrives to arrest her. The second element is an act that ensures the woman's survival. The soldiers have the wrong address and call on the apartment next door. The woman hides and hears how the military mistakenly kidnap her neighbor. Imagine the horror. This fact provokes a strong sense of guilt, which results in La Marca Preferida, the favorite brand, into the mother's depression and the constant reproaches of her daughters. Finally, the third element is repetition. The traumatic scene of the woman's non-arrest is repeated in the three pieces, in the speech of the character who experienced it, and in the performance of those trying to understand it. I will later return to Spoonberg's trilogy to analyze these elements, but for now, let's come back to Vogt and examine the question of ambivalence. La Mecánica sets a parallelism between migration and the death of a loved person, as though finding representations to register the losses of migration necessitated the literality of death. To make sense of this, we need to consider the ambivalence that taints the protagonist's relationship with Argentina. She loves its literature and its capital, Buenos Aires, but despises the corruption of its politics, the irrationality, as she sees it, of its society, the unreliability of her fellow citizens. How can a despised country be mourned? If you leave your country and you hate it, do you really mourn it? What does one lose when leaving a country that always disappoints? It is as if Vera couldn't mourn Argentina, and the separation from her country were a loss that had been negated, hidden, repressed, or simply left unrepresented. Her own mourning will be performed by reference to Eliseu Mussol, a character with a strong attachment to Catalonia, but also to a past that tortures him, for he is unable to mourn his losses. Eliseu is the head of Catalonia's most prestigious publishing house. Strict, obsessive, and meticulous, he overcame his humble social origins in the countryside, thanks to the support of Hilari, his school teacher and mentor, who encouraged him to further his education. Eliseu is haunted by the crime he committed in order to break his parents' opposition to his getting an education. He burned down the barn that housed the 3 pigs that ensured the family's subsistence. Eliseu's life is scarred by 3 deaths, those of his best friend Virgili, his mentor Hilari, and his ex-wife Lila. Those losses have left him unable to form new attachments. His unending mourning thus becomes an echo of Vera's, establishing what Darren Leader calls a dialogue of mournings. As Leader argues, finding a representation that echoes a person's experience of loss can initiate sorry, I missed one quotation. He says, finding a representation that echoes a person's experience of loss can initiate a mourning process. In a dialogue of mournings, the relation of the mourner to their loss, and that's the quotation on the screen, is mediated through the relation of another mourner to their own loss. In this way, lack becomes an object through this unconscious transaction between mourners. I find this idea of a dialogue between people in mourning quite beautiful. The dialogue of mournings in La Mecánica articulates a double dialectic as a means of working through ambivalence. There is firstly a dialectic between identification and disidentification, manifested in a conflict between experiencing the past as an indelible mark and rejecting the past to create a blank slate. And secondly, a dialectic between guilt, debt, and transgression. This latter set of terms is important because the existence of a debt seems to be at the heart of the character's ambivalence. What has Vera lost? She has not only lost her friend, but also a country that she despises. And yet, what part of herself has she lost in them? One possible answer would be that she has lost the sense of direction that the other, the lost other, helped Vera define, symbolized in the compass Fierita gave her. And this is echoed in Eliseu's story. In Hilari, Eliseu lost el mantó, l'agulla de la brúixola que indicava el punt cardinal correcte. Yet the quality of this sense of moral direction is questioned by the fixity of Fierita's compass, always pointing south, and by the effects of Hilari's guidance, which had led to an act of destruction. The idea of fixity is also present in Vera's transgressive act. The possibility of her escaping a position of subjective and economic stagnation depended on her theft. Her survival requires a decision and an act, but this act in turn becomes a burden because she internalizes her ambivalence through her identification with the belief that all Argentinians are thieves. That's her belief. Ambivalence may create a sense of debt in the mourner. As Lito argues, a problem occurs when a pervasive feeling of loyalty to the dead prevents any expression of ties to the living, giving rise to a powerful feeling of guilt. Our unconscious hatred is reversed into an overpowering sense of owing something to the dead. Loyalty always implies a certain sense of debt. The social dimension of mourning is thus implicit in the idea of debt, and not knowing what has been lost in the departed object is what causes a sense of debt. Vera's theft of $5,000 becomes at once a secret and a debt, with a paradoxical effect. It helps her survive and build a new life of herself, but the debt will attach to her sense of self in the form of an identification. This leads us to the second dialectic brought about by the dialogue of mournings, between past and future, old and new, fixity and movement. Vera's arrival in Barcelona is for her a liberating experience. And she says, l'urbs, àrida de records, de costums, de rutines i d'ecos, la fascina. És una pàgina en blanc. The city affords Vera a blank slate for a fresh start, the opportunity to compose la versió senzilla, neta i directa del relat de la vida. But of course, rebuilding one's life is not the same as the work of mourning. Vera presents herself as disidentified from Argentina. When her new friend Neil asks her why she left the country, she replies, "No sóc una migrant econòmica. El problema va ser que l'única cosa que em feia bé al mig de tanta irracionalitat, els llibres del meu escriptor favorit, també van desaparèixer rere les tanques del Corralito." Llavors, em vaig adonar que no estimava el meu país, perquè ningú pot estimar allò que sempre li fa mal. No sento orgull de ser argentina. And of course, we could question this idea that one cannot love those who hurt us. Vera's rationalizations, the denial of her migrant status, and her indifference to a national attachment conceal the impossibility of her fully rejecting her country. Not knowing what she has lost in leaving Argentina, her debt becomes a subjective stain. When Neil invites her to write an op-ed column on Argentina, the proposal causes within her un terratrèmol que desperta un volcà que escup lava. As she stands in the shower, the lava of this subjective volcano desglaça las llàgrimes of her frozen memory. She cries while remembering the events that led to her departure and her decision to steal the money. Despite her best intentions to return it, res no esborrarà de la seva consciència la taca que la converteix en una argentina arquetípica més. Una lladra en justificació, una traïdora amb excusa, una corrupta eventual. However, com que està fet i no hi ha marxa enrere, her life in Barcelona must succeed. The pressing need for survival is therefore an obstacle for carrying out the work of mourning. Once again, this tension is echoed in the dialogue of Mournings. Shortly after this scene, we see Eliseu having a shower, trying to remove from his body la pudor dels porcs enganxada a la pell, that has become indeleble, gairebé sòlida. Eliseu's ambivalence about his origin has turned into an indelible mark that prevents him from detaching himself from the dead. Later on, he hikes to the mountains in order to scatter Hilari's ashes. Eliseu opens the urn and takes some of the ash in his fingers. Li costa acceptar que aquella pols grisa siguin la pell, el cos i el cervell de l'Hilari. He brings the ash to his nose, but no ensuma res. The overpowering, imaginary stench of the burnt pigs attached to his skin results in a lack of the sense of smell that prevents him from bestowing a quantum of libido on the representation of his lost object. Unable to perform his ritual, he returns the ashes home. Later on, Vogt poignantly conveys the sense of frozen temporality of an unending mourning. Eliseu is at home, takes an hourglass, empties it, cleans it, fills it with Hilari's ashes, and turns it over. Amb la mirada fixa a la pols grisa que cau formant una petita muntanya a la base, l'Eliseu va marcant els segons, picant amb els artells de la mà, fins que una engruna gruixuda s'encalla al coll i atura el pas. And then he says, temps mort. Temps mort means time out, but also dead time. The flow of subjective time has frozen in a limbo that interrupts the circulation of desire. As for Vera, the effect of the debt persists in the abuse that she receives from fellow Argentines living in Catalonia. When her first column is published, she says all kinds of abuse on Argentina and Argentinians, and her fellow Argentinians don't particularly like that. Just as Argentina defaults on its debt, Vera is unable to return hers, and just as she despises traitors and liars, she is dubbed as one by her fellow Argentine expatriates. The second half of the novel focuses on the friendship between Vera and Eliseu. Their bond is deep and healing. It will help Eliseu conclude his mourning, and Vera will begin to miss Argentina while feeling a part of Catalan society. In the last section, and this is a big spoiler alert, Eliseo confronts with Vera's constant support the cancer that will kill him. And we encounter a final unexpected twist, the death of Vera's dog, Cantiano. If the dialogue of Mournings had so far been presented as a series of coincidences, now it becomes an actual conversation. But the coincidences in the first half of the novel reinforce the impression that this transaction between mourners is actually unconscious. This, and the final twist, are indications of Vought's attention to form. In other words, the quality of the text of being a literary artifact. And this is a quality of being an artifact that the novel amplifies rather than conceals, suggesting one of the processes Darren Leader identifies in the work of Mourning, the introduction of a symbolic artificial space. When I say that this character of being a literary artifact, it's because sometimes the style might sound a bit affected, and critics picked up on that. But I think it's really very much a part of what the author was trying to do in terms of constructing this object that deals with mourning. So, the introduction of a symbolic artificial space. The leader says that mourning requires the register of artificiality that permits to symbolize loss. And the representations of the lost object must be framed and represented as representations, enabling loss to be inscribed in a symbolic space. In the text that we are analyzing today, this register of artificiality is set in motion in various ways, but in all cases at the service of a specific construction of memory. Vought's novel never makes reference to the family that Vera has left behind in Argentina or to the country's recent history, as if she were alone in the world. By contrast, in Spoonberg's trilogy, the presence of the militant mother and the aftermath of the dictatorship are constant. In Vought's novel, memory is like the water of the sea, hitting, bouncing, and returning, amb la seva mecànica implacable, with its with its implacable, relentless mechanics. In Spoonberg's work, memory is fragile. As la narradora in El meu avi, My Grandfather Didn't Go to Cuba, says, les paraules que diem aquí no són del tot fidels a la realitat. These are the words of a narrator. La fragilitat de la memòria dispersa els fets, els fa vulnerables, el llenguatge, la imaginació, el discurs manipulen els fets. The subtitle of the trilogy refers to the difficulty implicit in this fragility, how to narrate an abyssal experience. Narration itself facilitates working through trauma and the creative reconstruction of the torn psychic fabric, so that the subject can sustain itself again. I wish to focus precisely on this creative aspect of symbolization, by reference to this register of artificiality that frames the representations of the lost object. In La Fragilidad de la Memoria, this effect is achieved through its meta-theatrical elements. As the author says in a note, la peça està construïda des de l'escena. El text, per si sol, és una suma de fragments que acaba de completar-se amb les accions dels intèrprets, la música en directe i el disseny de so. Té un clar component metateatral, performatiu i autobiogràfic. Fragmentation, meta-theatricality, and performativity impact the definition of the characters, whose inability to understand the events of the dramatic scene they play unsettles and dislocates them. This is the case of the young actress in El meu avi, a drama student and a Catalan of Andalusian origin. The piece stages the process of making a film about the Latin American revolutionaries In the first part of the play, the casting, the actress introduces herself, immediately raising the problem of her identification. And she says, encara no he entès en quin idioma o accent haig d'interpretar el personatge. Porto anys practicant la meva dicció catalana i castellana, així que cap problema. Bé, haig de dir que soc d'origen andalús, però em sento d'aquí, totalment d'aquí. En realitat, que sigui d'un altre lloc és ideal per al personatge. The Argentinian film director questions her understanding of the script. Then the actress plays the scene in which she receives a call warning of the arrest of her friend and telephones her comrades. Later, a narradora, narrator in the feminine, contextualizes the historical details of the facts performed on the stage, says that the woman managed to go into exile with her family, and insists on the inability of language to faithfully represent these facts. Then the actress, out of character, elaborates on the arrival of the military and the kidnapping of the neighbor. And she says, and this is the actress out of character, being the actress. ¿Qué hace? Sorry. ¿Qué hace? Se esconde. Ella se esconde de lo que ha visto. Se esconde de lo que no ha visto, de lo que imagina. Imagino que se llevan a la vecina del cuarto segunda, la meten en un Ford Falcon, le ponen una capucha en la cabeza. Imagino su miedo, la culpa infinita por no haber intervenido, la vecina secuestrada y ella no. Pudo haberla salvado y no lo hizo. Imagino la escena una y otra vez. Me imagino con otro acento. Ser d'aquí i només d'aquí. There's this element of code switching. D'una bona família d'aquí, arrelada y fent la millor oberta de tot el país. Y luego imagino un acento sin rumbo, el teléfono, lo indecible. No puedo imaginarlo. A similar dialectic occurs in La Marca Preferida. Sara and Valentina, the daughters of the exiled militants, are torn between satisfying their consumer drives in 1990s Catalonia and trying to understand the depression of a mother who had been active in the armed struggle to change society. The two sisters repeatedly act out the traumatic scene of the mother. But this performance only highlights the difficulty in metabolizing their mother's trauma and finding a place for it in their speech. This is shown both in language and in the uses of memory. Sara says, vamos a olvidar todo lo malo, todo lo que sea de Argentina a la basura. Stressing her peninsular accent, Sara chastises her sister. Pareces una sudaca chunga con este acento ridículo. Sudaca is the derogatory term for Latin Americans. Con este acento ridículo. Ni siquiera parece auténtico. Pareces una actriz de doblaje cutre con este acento ridículo. Valentina responds, unsuccessfully attempting an Argentine accent. Vos sos mi hermana, ¿cierto? Con los demás me adapto. Tenemos que conservar nuestras raíces. And my attempt is as unsuccessful as hers. Both the actress and the sisters face the difficulty of understanding a meaningless experience. At one level, they manifest the problem of incorporating inherited traumatic events into a collective memory articulated with an individual identity. At another level, the metatheatrical artifice facilitates the inscription of loss in a symbolic space. The actress and the sister's alienation with respect to accents reveals the dislocation of these characters vis-à-vis language, since no accent can faithfully express their interiority. But the void that this dislocation lays bare opens up the possibility of a new discourse that authentically conveys subjectivity. In the radio piece that closes Spoonberg's trilogy, These embodied voices express the suffering of these subjects, be it the pain of the militant mother, be it the daughter's inability to bear the mother's pain. It is the discursive expression of this pain that finally makes communication between the two possible. I'll return now to La Mecànica de l'Aigua. One of the formal devices whereby Vogt creates this register of artificiality is the use of repetitions. This is unsurprising because of the close relationship repetition holds with trauma and with the death drive. Repetition is also implicit in the dialectic of memory at work in Mourning. Lefebvre says that this dialectic is about comment conserver et modifier à la fois, accéder à la mémoire et modifier son matériau. This dialectic of conservation and change turns memory into a site of subjective conflict. Remembering causes pain, but it also sets desire back in motion. The unconscious movement of memory is beautifully evoked by the metaphor that lends the novel its title. It refers to a passage in the first chapter in which Vera, still in Buenos Aires, contemplates the Rio de la Plata. Es queda hipnotitzada amb les onades que colpegen amb força contra el ciment, com si el riu no estigués d'acord amb la manera com l'han empresonat i volgués alliberar-se a força d'insistir. Colpeja, rebota i torna. Colpeja, rebota i torna. This repetitive movement is inseparable from the work of Mourning. As Lefebvre argues, repetition allows the subject to symbolize loss and inscribe itself into a narrative. Vogt underscores the role of language and narration in this process. For example, Eliseu's proud transmission of la seva versió de la història del país makes Vera feel enveja per algú que pot estimar amb tanta convicció un tros de terra. Vera's desire to tell her own story awakens in Eliseu a fresh approach to the enigma of the other. Només li interessa estar amb algú nou, que funciona amb un codi diferent, amb un manual d'instruccions d'ús desconegut. Opening oneself to the enigma of the other involves accepting the paradox of embracing the social bond that language makes possible, while taking on the foreignness of language to human beings. According to Vera, God was a foreigner who created the adjectives per nosaltres, els estrangers, per assegurar-nos que ens entenen, per si de cas algú entengués amor quan estàs dient amort. Indeed, love and death are intimately linked in Mourning. Darien Leder reminds us that for Freud, the work of Mourning involves a declaration on the part of the subject that the lost object is dead. This declaration amounts symbolically to killing the dead, eventually leading to the acceptance of ambivalence. However, the mourner still has to resolve the question of what she has lost in the deceased. Following Lacan, Leder argues that mourning requires constituting the object as effectively lost. That is, having registered psychically an empty space that must be internalized. Constituting an object means separating the images of those things that matter to us from the place they occupy, in order to facilitate our recognition of the fundamental alterity of the lost object, showing that beyond the familiar image of ourselves and of the person we have lost lies the presence of something else, unrepresentable, opaque, a hole in our psychical world. This unrepresentable whole reveals that, at an unconscious level, that part of us that part of the one we love was always lost, even when they were with us. However, since love is narcissistically structured, the problem of mourning is how to restore the links to the object as lost, while relinquishing the image of who we were for them. For this reason, mourning demands a certain sacrifice, a sacrifice of our own links to the image. Mourning must mark out the place of a symbolic sacrifice so that the other objects can go into the place of the lost loved one. At this point, and before embarking on the final stretch of my presentation, I would like to make a brief comment on Patricia Gavancho's novel, La Neta d'Adam. It offers a counterpart to Vogt and Spoonberg, since Gavancho did not emigrate because of the dictatorship of the Corralitos, nor does her novel contain such a clear traumatic center. It is indeed a novel of mourning that represents both Argentine immigration to Catalonia and European immigration to Argentina, and at the same time, by reconstructing the figure of the dead mother, illustrates Darien Leader's ideas about the need to kill the dead and the constitution of the object as lost. La Neta d'Adam narrates the return to Buenos Aires of Angélica Goyeneche after the death of her mother, Bela. During her stay in her hometown, Angélica, an Argentine journalist living in Catalonia since the 1970s, will empty Bela's apartment. As she disposes of her mother's belongings, the narrator reconstructs the story of la família d'immigrants que eren els Goyeneche, en què 3 dels avis d'Angélica havien arribat a Buenos Aires fugint de la pobresa europea. At the same time, while Angélica recalls the different trips to Buenos Aires she has made in recent years to take care of her mother, the protagonist also remembers her own life in relation to her affective attachments in Argentina, and in the meantime rebuilds the figure of Bela. She says, tota la casa era plena d'aquests petits detalls, imatges fixes de la Bela, que Angélica anava recollint cada dia amb més intensitat, com qui configura amb les peces la imatge d'un puzzle. La Bela anava adquirint una presència gairebé sòlida. In Gavancho's novel, the mother's image is reconstructed as a declaration that Bela is finally gone. In the process of emptying the apartment and giving away Bela's belongings as mementos, concludes the work of mourning, restoring the links with a mother who now appears in her radical otherness, and literally opening a void that allows access to the new. In the final pages of La Mecánica del Agua, we find a similar process, but expressed in a much more tragic way. We witness Vera's double sacrifice and the birth of a new subjective narrative. Vera looks after Eliseu as she develops a very aggressive cancer. He endures excruciating pain and loses most of his mental faculties, but he manages to convey to Vera a plea for help. Tu saps on és la morfina. In the last few pages, Vera arrives in Eliseu's home to find a stunned nurse and an agitated Eliseu just returned from a stroll with Vera's dog, Cantiano, who has been run over by a car and now lies dead in his lap. Shortly thereafter, a numb, devastated Vera carries out Eliseu's request and administers him a lethal dose of morphine. Eliseu's death involves her own death, metafòrica però igual de contundent i irreversible. Something inside her has been declared irretrievably lost in a double sacrifice. She has had to relinquish both the person who helped her unfreeze her subjectivity and the only thing she brought with her from Argentina, her dog Cantiano. The last lines of the novel convey poignantly this sense of detachment. Li tanca les parpelles i després es fica carn endins, en una mena d'exili interior, fins a desaparèixer. Però jo la veig. Encara puc veure-la, perquè la memòria, com l'aigua, colpeja, rebota i torna amb la seva mecànica implacable. Imprescindible, com la distància entre la primera i la tercera persona a l'hora d'escriure aquesta història. Colpeja, rebota i torna. Colpeja, rebota i torna. Em veig. Colpeja, rebota i torna. Puc veure'm. Colpeja, rebota i torna fins que trenca la pedra i llisca. What is most relevant and remarkable about this ending is the inscription of the scene of writing and the dissociation of the narrative voice, both of which denote an act of witnessing. As Lofer points out, le deuil est un événement qui, pour s'inscrire dans l'histoire du sujet, doit devenir un témoignage. La division entre le sujet de l'énoncé et le sujet de l'énonciation permet l'irruption d'une parole autre. In Vogt's sophisticated textual symbolization of loss, Beda experiences mourning as an inner exile that tears her from herself, and in the act of witnessing, she has created the psychic space, the psychic place of burial necessary to open up a space for the new. The relentless mechanics of water, then, resembles the work of memory, not only in the persistence of the mourner, who confronts and exhausts the representations of the lost object, but also in the insistent movement of the drives that finally win the day and allow both body and writing to be flooded with desire. To conclude, the text that we have examined today offers us a view of migratory mourning that is not based on nostalgia, but on the acknowledgement of negativity, ambivalence, and the traumatic dimension of migration. They promote a conception of subjectivity based on emptiness, separation, and loss, whereby mourning transforms the identity of the migrant, but also the reception society. We have seen how a character in Spoonberg's trilogy speaks of keeping her roots, while Vogt's protagonist rejects hers, and in Gavancho's novel, there is a loving detachment from one's roots. In my introduction, I referred to the reactive role of the trope of cultural roots in Catalan discourses as a defense against a perceived threat of dissolution of Catalan identity. The epitome of this is a well-known verse by Raimon, the songwriter par excellence of anti-Franco resistance. And he sang, "Qui perd els orígens perd identitat. He who loses his origins loses his identity." But this idea, I would argue, is false, because identity is always contingent, and it may only last if origins are subject to constant revision. If we conceive subjectivity in the separation from oneself, then loss and emptiness allow for the circulation of desire, and mourning makes it possible to forge new identifications. So perhaps we could rewrite Raimon's verse in a different way. She who loses her origins will gain an identity if she performs the work of mourning. In the portrayal of migration as a transformative experience, these texts may facilitate a dialogue of mournings in Catalan culture. Migrants work through the loss of a country with which they may maintain an ambivalent relationship. And this echoes a process in which Catalan society must mourn the loss of its own attachment to the idea of an identity centered around the full substantive origin. Middle Ages and so on. If this is the case, then the promise of a new beginning arising from loss suggests that our analysis of Catalan identity must take into account the place and the role of mourning in its discursive construction in order to define an idea of Catalan identity as decentered and built around an empty origin, and to deploy the social, cultural, and political potential of this idea. Thank you.